The love of the truth is often mentioned, the hatred of truth hardly ever, yet the latter is the commoner. People say they love the truth when they pursue it, and they pursue it when unknown, not therefore because of any felt affinity to it in their souls, but probably because they need information for practical purposes or to solve some conventional riddle. Where known, on the contrary, truth is almost always dismissed or disguised, because the aspect of it is hateful, and this apart from any devilish perversity in the natural man or accidental vices that may fear the light. On the contrary, the cause is rather the natural man's innocence and courage in thinking himself the measure of all things. Life imposes selfish interests and subjective views on every inhabitant of earth. And in hugging these interests and these views, the man hugs what he initially assumes to be the truth and the right. So that aversion from the real truth, a sort of antecedent hatred of it as contrary to presumption, is interwoven into the very fabric of thought. Images and feelings do not arise without a certain vital enthusiasm in forming or affirming them. To enjoy them is in some sense to hypostasize them and set them up as models to which other images and feelings should conform. A child will protest and be inwardly wounded if a story once told him is told differently the second time. His little soul has accepted that world and needs to build upon it undisturbed. Sensation, which makes the foreground of what is called experience, is thus raised by innocent faith to the level of truth. And false these images and feelings would not be if they provoked no assertions about further objects. They would compose the ingredients of a true biography, although perhaps, when the circumstances are considered, the biography of a dupe. Now, love is a passion, and we might expect it not to be aroused at all by intellectual objects such as truth or theory purporting to be true. And yet, the bitterest feuds in families and nations often turn on the love or hatred of particular beliefs, attacked or defended for the most fantastic reasons. Both sides may perhaps say that they are fighting for the truth, but evidently it is not any circumstantial evidence that supports the claims of the opposed ideas to be veridical, nor is there often much intrinsic beauty in those ideas. The theological notion of the Trinity was little affected by the iota for which nevertheless blood flowed in the streets of Byzantium. Yet the metaphysical dignity of the Virgin Mary was involved, and nobody should be suffered to question the truth of a devout image so fondly lodged in the mind. In such a case, the passion concerned is not the love of truth, but a natural joy in thinking freely, and the self-assertion of each mind against all others. If, meantime, any attention is paid to the truth at all, it is only indirectly, in that the ideal authority of truth is recognized, whilst by an absurd contradiction its verdict is dedicated to it by violence. The truth is needed but not respected, not loved but raped. And that barbarous outrage to the truth in the concrete is still a sort of homage to the truth as the coveted sanction of fancy. Modern philosophers seem hardly aware of the extent to which they still reason on these principles, where economy as a criterion of truth is the weapon of a monstrous self-mutilation with which British philosophy, if consistent, would soon have committed suicide. Only if all ideas were condemned to be blind and ugly, like a secret telegraphic code, would there be a human advantage in having the fewest and the baldest ideas possible. Again, even then, only because thinking would be a loss, a waste of energy to be reduced to the practicable minimum. As to the truth of simple rather than elaborate ideas, what evidence does nature or history afford for such a presumption? Is nature sparing of atoms or seeds, of depths of organization and interrelation beyond the reach of human thought? Doubtless, when applied to scholastic entities conceived as dominant elements or powers, conceive that is as limiting the exuberance and waste in nature. Occam's razor might serve to clear the ground for a richer crop of ideas. But for what ideas? I see no lilies of the field. I see only an expanse of coal dust. In fact, most scholastic distinctions were made in the effort to clarify the mind and bring language nearer to the precise relations of things. This philosophy was not experimental physics. It did not trace the movements of matter on their own plane. It studied rather the functions that things might have in the life of reason, as classic rhetoric and morals had defined that life. Such humanism was itself a monument to self-complacency in the home mind and aversion from arctic and torrid truth. But at least in its own dimension it was diligent. So are modern mathematics and physics, to a degree that renders them more inventive and unintelligible than any philosophy. But though many of their terms, or all, may be figments of human method, they play respectfully round the profound complexity of things. And there is more modesty and love of truth in the better men of science than in the old scholastics, in that they admit that their conventions are largely arbitrary and symbolic. A false truth is often attributed to human ideas, even when they are not taken for physical objects or powers. Aesthetic, moral, or political sentiments, for instance, because they arouse a certain enthusiasm, are proclaimed as truths. Individuals and parties entrench themselves within those maxims with all the ferocity of hatred and fear of the besieging reality. I would prove that no such feelings can express any objective truth, but only the life of some biological or political organism. That every organism must have its own form of life and must love and defend it goes without saying. But why poison the inevitable conflict of possible forms by insulting your rivals and saying they have no right to attempt to live? Courage that in a rational being would be courteous, then borrows the blindness and useless cruelty of instinct, and the legitimate will to live usurps the authority of destiny, which determines what forms of life at any time and place may actually prosper. Truly great men, nobly dominant wills, appeal indeed to that authority of destiny which they feel working within them, and common moralizing does the same thing when, without anger or false threats, it points to the vanity of some ambitions and the miserable consequences of some vices. Plato reports the humorous saying of Socrates that dogs are philosophical because they bark at strangers, thereby showing how much they prize knowledge. Intentionally or unintentionally, there is a play here upon the word knowledge. This name is given at once and sophistically, both to familiarity and to understanding, so that fondness for what we happen to know and hostility towards what we happen not to know are identified with the love of truth. Yet in fact they are the exact opposite. What we and the dogs love is our safety, our home thoughts, our illusions, and our undisputed confidence and habit. Undoubtedly, in controversial moments, we defend our ideas under the name of great and evident truths, as we defend our worldly possessions under the name of natural rights. In this, we manifest our animal nature, like faithful dogs, and are biologically admirable and morally blameless. There is indeed something candid and honest in trusting appearance and in being loyal to convention, but to be dogged about these things with a clear conscience is hardly possible to an intelligent man. A dull child may tell the truth without understanding it, not in the least for the love of the truth, but simply for lack of alternatives. Had he had a less sluggish imagination, he might have invented some aimless lie. Stupidity is positivistic, and sometimes, as in science, literal and uninterpreted reports are useful. They are trustworthy as far as they go, and allow us to do our own thinking. For the thinking spirit, however, Literalness is simple slavery to appearance or to convention on the level of sense, a slavery that an intellectual coward may sometimes love. It saves him from discovering a truth secretly felt to be inhuman. Sensuous appearance and spontaneous language are nevertheless far from hostile to the truth. They are the first steps in the pursuit of it. Nature takes good care to discredit our young idolatries, and drives us from one image to another, from each thought to some alternative thought, not often by the force of logic, which indeed would rather tighten its coils about us and enclose us in an impenetrable cocoon of its own weaving. Conviction always abounds in its own sense, as in theology, but what breaks at last through such a charmed circle is wild nature, within and without. A thousand contrary facts, a thousand rebel emotions, drive us from our nest. We find that there can be no peace in delusion, and perhaps in this negative and moral guise the idea of truth first insinuates itself into the mind. No spiritual understanding, no generous interest in the truth on its own level and for its own sake, only discomfort and uncertainty, uneasiness about things hidden, and a prudent concern for the future. In positing the future and the hidden and also the past, we have already posited truth, but blindly, without distinguishing intellectually truth, which we might discover and possess, from facts extinct or unborn or incommunicable. We do not in the least care to discover or possess the truth, but we wish to be armed to face the obdurate facts, and our pride recoils from the confusion of finding ourselves mistaken. Better then we should buy no clothes, not likely to wear well. Hence a certain shrewdness and prudence in conceiving matters closely affecting us, each man in his own trade, each woman in her own circle. But this specialized sagacity is remote from the love of truth, not only in motive but in scope. The foundation is laid in egotism, in partiality, in injustice. Enormous tracts of relevant reality are willfully ignored, and the result is some slander or some party tenet or some superstition, defended pugnaciously rather because it is preciously false than because it is presumably true. The more these self-indulgent minds fear and hate the truth, the more insistently they give the name of truth to the mask that hides it. That fiction and convention should usurp in this manner the authority of truth, an authority which, however ideal it may be, is logically absolute, naturally arouses the ire of the critical, and it is not without reason that individual investigators, reformers, and heretics feel that they are champions of the truth. They are, in fact, rebels against imposture, and it is not without reason that individual investigators, reformers, and heretics feel that they are champions of the truth. They are, in fact, rebels against imposture, yet they ordinarily have many stronger and nearer motives for their zeal than love of truth for its own sake, love of ideas, novelties, adventure, controversy, and power. Take the case where bias and ulterior motive seems most radically absent, the case of the scientific empiricist. A compass in one hand and a balance in the other, he may say he is pursuing the truth, yet an exact recording of his experiments would hardly disclose anything more enlightening than would the sights and gossip of the street. They would be glimpses and gossip about matter, not about human affairs. And this is far from implying that the glimpses or gossip would be truer. On the contrary, it is precisely about the social world that a man's surface impressions are apt to be adequate. The object is like the medium. And indeed, the scientific man is not likely to be satisfied with the bare record of his experiments, which would report the strict truth of his investigation. Instead, every experiment will suggest to him some new theory, or will seem to illustrate and confirm some old theory familiar to his mind. So fortified, he may be doubly ready to denounce the errors of his more conventional neighbors, whom he probably dislikes on other grounds, and wishes to supersede in public estimation. Nor is this always the merely inevitable admixture of different passions in a human being. The pure theory advanced is not likely in the end to be truer than the views it replaces. It is often truer in some particular, but when its tendency and oversights are considered, it very seldom increases the harmony between man and nature. Perhaps if critical and empirical motives governed science absolutely, science would disappear. Autobiography would replace it with a perfect democracy of theories, as so many idle ideas, going with different moods, and when memory and solipsism have been criticized in their turn, the so-called zeal for truth would end by denying the notion of truth altogether. That would be the second childhood of the mind, instead of innocent joy in appearance and in language, as if nothing could be false. There would be a collapse into idiocy, as if nothing could be true. Vigorous critics and innovators are far from such apathy. They strip off the mask of truth only to substitute another, as the truer image. And they very likely join the elder dogmatists in maintaining that in the mask they propose, the likeness to the original is perfect. Not all an honest man's zeal, be he a traditionalist or a reformer, is arrested at the specific doctrines which he identifies with the truth. The better part pierces that symbol and rests in the truth itself, pure and absolute, which wears that mask for him for the moment, so that all is not hypocrisy in this partisan or fantastic zeal. Within the fanatical defense of vested illusions, there may be a sacrificial respect for things beyond us, whatever those secret realities may be, and the martyr that on earth is ready to die for some false opinion may be judged in heaven to have died for the truth. The very absurdity of a tenet, or its groundlessness, at least proves that imagination is at work and groping for an issue from animal darkness. At least the category of truth has been set up. Appearances, innocent and perfectly real in themselves, have begun to be questioned and discounted as deceptive, and this not merely against the blank background of a posited substance, known only as force, but in contrast to a possible and more adequate description of that substance and of the manner in which it produces appearances. Intelligence has begun the pursuit of truth. Does this pursuit ever really deserve the name of love? No doubt there must be a total and exact collocation of facts, and the universe must have a form which we call the truth of it. But why should anyone love that collocation? In its perhaps infinite and certainly inhuman minuteness and extent, why should anyone desire to know what that tiresome truth may be, except for human purposes in the region and on the scale of our gross experience? We may love our pleasures, our perceptions, our dogmas. We may love safety and dominion in action, and victory in argument. But if the truth is none of these things, why should we love it? There is no reason why we should love the truth. There is no reason why we should love anything. There are only causes that, according to the routine of nature, bring about the love of various things on various occasions. As a matter of fact, nature breeds life, and life is everywhere aflame with love, and with its opposite. And there is also no reason why this spiritual passion, spiritual because it engages the colors of the spirit, should stop short at bodily concerns or social affairs, and should not extend to all the relations radiating from bodily life into the realms of truth and of essence. This radiation, as I call it, is in itself passive and merely formal, yet physical organization must take account of it if life is to prosper. And this tension of life towards the eventual, the distant, the past, and the future is what becomes conscious and bursts into actuality in spirit. Spirit is a child of truth. Matter in any one of its moments and in any one of its atoms offers no foothold for consciousness. But let certain tropes and cycles be established in the movement of matter. Let certain kinds of matter cohere and pulse together in an organism, and behold, consciousness has arisen. Now tropes, cycles, organisms, and pulsations with all the laws of nature are units proper to the realm of truth, units that bridge the flux of existence and are suspended over it, as truth and spirit also are suspended. So that in conceiving and loving the truth, spirit is not indulging in any caprice, it is surveying with pleasure the soil and the broad reaches of its own native country. Nor is love too warm a term for the sense of this radical affinity. There is a cosmic justification for such a passion. Love is, biologically, an emotion proper to generation, and generation in the cosmos at large is the same thing as genesis or flux. Love, ever since Hesiod and Empedocles, has therefore been the poetic name for the instability and fecundity of transitive existence everywhere. Life passing and passing joyfully from each phase to the next and from one individual to another. Yet this joyful procreation of things is also tragic because, as Lucretius says, nothing is born save by the death of something else. In loving, in breeding, and in bringing up the young, we make an unconscious sacrifice of ourselves to posterity. Such is the dominance of love in the realm of matter, where progression is, as it were, horizontal, and the thing generated continues and repeats the nature of its parents. But where the transmitted form is organic and spirit inhabits it, life and love have also a vertical direction and a synthetic power, such that in precipitating the future, the present evokes some images of the past, and some notion of the outlying realities by which the present and the future are being controlled. In other words, life, in propagating itself, has also generated knowledge, and has become aware of the truth. This byproduct or hypostasis of organic life is also tragic, like physical reproduction, and accepts death. But instead of surrendering one life for another of the same kind and on the same level, we now surmount or disregard physical life altogether in order to define its form and consider its achievements. This consideration or definition of nature is itself a work of nature, occurring in time and requiring material organs. It therefore partakes of the joy proper to all vital functions in their perfection. The beauty of truth is loved as naturally as the beauty of women, and our ideas are cherished like our children. Enthusiasm and inspiration, which are other names of love addressed to the truth, have no less warmth and breed no less heroism than the love of home or of country. Thus spirit is born and chooses its aims in sympathy with the movement of organic life, and it is simply the movement become emotion and idea. For this radical reason, spirit cannot be an independent power coming from nowhere to direct or accelerate animal action. We do not look about us because we love the truth, but we love the truth because we look about us. Were it merely a question of keeping alive or of controlling matter, business would actually be expedited if besides Occam's razor we used, so to speak, Occam's glasses and reduced our visions of things to pointer readings, releasing appropriate reactions on our part without further rhetoric. Ignorance, when not materially dangerous, simplifies the fighting mind and is an economic advantage. It renders courage absolute and disturbs no comfortable or harmless illusions. Nature, however, being spontaneous and free, with no end of time before her, despises such thrift and is initially lavish and all-consenting. Her indefinite passive fertility is committed to no antecedent prejudices or desires. She adopts her laws and types unwittingly as they avail to establish themselves, and they leave untouched her original potentialities. They may become indeed positive occasions for playful complications far outrunning those special terms and eluding their measure. Such a complication life seems to us to be in respect to mechanism, and consciousness in respect to life. In these cases, the new fruit, while having an underivable character proper to itself, will draw all its existential sap from the tree on which it is grafted. Life requires food, warmth, and air, yet is none of those things but an organization accruing to them, and spirit feeds on the life of the psyche, while establishing tangential and transcendent interests of its own. When feeling, a form of spirit evoked by organic processes in the body, becomes perception and begins to describe the objects that arouse feeling, spirit is already launched upon the pursuit of truth, an ideal reality altogether transcending the level of the psyche and of her world. When, moreover, the eye and the intellect have adequately surveyed the scene, or gathered the event observed into a dramatic unity, the organ of spirit is satisfied. It is satisfied in the very act by which a truth is discerned. so that by nature this discernment is a joy to the spirit, and the truth automatically conceived becomes an object of love for its own sake. The vital and fundamentally physical quality of this love of truth appears clearly when it is thwarted. We see daily in young children and in impatient reformers how nothing is more hateful to a passionate being than obstruction, nothing more precious than liberty. The psyche will have her own way in the first place, let the result be what it will. Indeed, the primitive horror of being stifled, of being held down and prevented from moving, is doubtless what lends its magic to the word liberty. Any idea of what we might do with our liberty when we got it would have no such power. To be checked in our natural actions before we initiate them produces melancholy. To be checked in the middle of them produces rage. This intolerableness of suppression extends to the movement of our thoughts. It was in the act of spinning fine long threads of relationship that nature first evoked spirit. That web must not be torn, and nature demands that spirit should think the truth. We cannot endure to be cheated, to be deluded, even to suspect that we are deceiving ourselves. We may be incurious about remote truths if our intellect is lazy, but at least we do not stultify what intellect we have by believing things positively false. Therefore, when authority or public opinion would hold us down to some manifest error, however harmless and metaphysical, our impetuous souls resent the outrage. It is not the calm truth that calls for witnesses. Martyrs usually die for some new error. It is the martyrs that cannot endure in themselves the arrest of the heart upon thoughts that the heart despises. No matter how tragic or error the truth may be, the spirit follows and loves it, as the eye follows the light. Automatic as the love of truth is, and internal as is the joy of discovering and holding the truth, this love has nothing narcissistic about it. It is as far as possible from being joy of the luster or harmony of one's ideas. It is a clean, healthy, sacrificial love. In the form of childish curiosity, it is turned from the beginning towards alien things, engaging the impulse to explore, to dissect, and to dare. The element of courage united with submission and humility belongs to the love of truth even in its ultimate reaches. Truth, in spite of what the Platonists and poets may say, is not at all the same as beauty. Truth does not arrange or idealize its subject facts. It can eliminate nothing. It can transfigure nothing, except by merely lifting it bodily from the plane of existence and exhibiting it, not as a present lure or as a disaster for some native ambition, but as a comedy or tragedy, seen as a whole and liberating the spirit that understands it. In other words, truth is moral, not an aesthetic good. The possession of it is not free intuition, but knowledge necessary to a man's moral integrity and intellectual peace. That conventional truths as exhibited to the senses or in historical narrative or scientific exposition may often be impressive aesthetically goes without saying. But it is not this aesthetic quality that makes their truth or satisfies the intellect. If truth at first entertains, as falsehood does also, it very soon sobers and rebukes. It is tragic even in comedy, since it looks to the end of every career and every achievement. The very movement of instinctive exploration that discloses truth thereby discloses also the relativity, limits, and fugitiveness of this exploration. It shows life under the form of eternity, which is the form of death. Life thereby becomes an offering, a prayer, a sacrifice offering up to the eternal. And though there may be incense in that sacrifice, there is also blood. Such affinity as there is between truth and beauty has various sources. When the word truth is colored idealistically to mean the types or potential perfections of things, as when we speak of a true friend, evidently if this latent truth could only be brought about and raised to actual fact, it would also realize the beautiful. Love and charity are quick to perceive the latent perfections in the imperfect. And if we call this, perhaps imaginary, potentiality the truth, we indeed divine the principle of beauty also. Of that beauty which the organic impulses of nature would bring to light if they had their way and did not interfere with one another. Even this partial chaos and mutual destruction, when we see it to be the truth, for the very reason that we are interested in the beauties destroyed, has a cathartic effect. It is sublime, and if we call the sublime of a part the beautiful, the truth, even when distressing and ugly, will be horribly beautiful to us. Both naturalism and romanticism work this vein of merciless poetry. Religion often does the same thing indirectly and aided by myths. The heart is taught to transmute its affections so as to make them consonant with the will of God, that is, with truth. But here we may see the danger of forced assimilations of the true to the good or to the beautiful. False views are often called true in order to make the truth more consoling, and on the other hand, moral and aesthetic values are often distorted by being torn from their roots in animal soil and stretched on a rack of cosmic dimensions. The starry spaces bring us face to face with the depths of reality hidden by the light of day. We find that spectacle beautiful and sublime in its inhumanity, and the better part of our humanity then seems to be our capacity to rise above ourselves. But it is in fact one part of us that here eludes or rebukes another part. Nature is necessarily full of beauties, since our faculties of perception and sympathy would not subsist if they were not adapted to the facts of nature, and the truth is necessarily satisfying for the same reason. Yet nature is also full of ugly, cruel, and horrible things, and the truth in many ways is desolating, because our nature, though sufficiently harmonious with the universe to exist within it, is nevertheless finite and specific, with essential interests which nature and truth at large cannot but disregard. The truth, then, is often in many ways interesting, beautiful, and sublime, but it is not identical with beauty, either in quality or extension or status. Undoubtedly, in their different ways, truth and beauty are both liberating, and when mystics identify them, it may be because they are exalted by both above the travail of existence. In the case of beauty, this deliverance is spontaneous and innocent. The spirit takes wing at birth and flutters from flower to flower without suspecting that any other fate awaits it. But the deliverance that comes through the truth comes through sorrow, is redemption by the cross. The more inhuman the truth turns out to be, the more dismal or cruel, so much greater is the self-conquest involved in facing it, in casting away false hopes, and entrenching ourselves impregnably in our insignificance. The very act of recognizing our insignificance, if sincere and not a mask for new claims, removes the sting of that insignificance. There is even something sadistic in the pleasure with which certain religious minds gloat on their own misery, as if they could never trample enough on their bleeding hearts or dance enough on their graves. But there is no occasion to exaggerate. To be finite is not a sin. To be ignorant is not a disgrace. The pleasures of illusion and those of disillusion are equally human. Pure insight into truth surmounts human bias in both directions impartially, without in the least hating or condemning the life that involves such bias. For to hate or condemn finitude is as finite as to cling to any particular form of finitude with an absolute fury. Intuition is liberating on every level, in each case defining the proper and adequate object of the faculty concerned. In sensation, intuition liberates some essence from the obscurity and tangle of fact. From passion, it liberates eloquence, poetry, and beauty. From the known world, it liberates truth. The operation of each faculty, so perfected, turns into clear joy. To take the full measure of anything, especially of anything living, establishes, quite apart from practical advantages, a spiritual dominion over that thing. You have seen it, you have seen through it, you have seen round it. It no longer can hold you to any weak or unmerited regard. It no longer can torture you with a useless hatred. Moreover, in partly lifting your ignorance, the truth has liberated you from avidity for knowledge. Fortune can never unveil to you more than a part of the truth, such part as is important for you and as you can digest. This part, seen under the form of eternity, can then cease to be external to you. it can become a truth and familiar rhythm in your own life, and this part of your life, being absorbed in pure intuition, will no longer seem consciously yours, nor concerned with your personal fortunes. It will be a light revealing the truth to you, and will be lost in the eternity of that which it knows. Nevertheless, in the dead season of the mind, when every generous faculty is paralyzed, it may become incredible that an immaterial reality or material unreality, like the truth, should ever be prized or even conceived. This doubt or denial is incidental to intellectual decay, but that fact does not count from the point of view of the decadence. We must therefore examine the position from within, in its subjective origin and logic.